The island humans were forbidden to visit. The island that should not be reached. Far out across a restless stretch of ocean, beyond the paths of cargo ships and fishing vessels, there exists an island that appears on maps, but not in travel guides. It has no resorts, no airstrip, no welcoming harbor. For centuries, sailors were warned to stay away. Not because of storms, not because of reefs, but because of something far older, and far more deliberate. Tonight's story is about an island that humans were explicitly forbidden to visit. An island surrounded by silence, guarded by isolation, and marked by a long history of vanished expeditions, government restrictions, and unanswered questions. This is not a story of one accident. It is not a single event. It is a pattern. And to understand why this island remains untouched to this day, we must begin long before modern borders, satellites, or warning signs. We must begin with the earliest accounts, when the island was first seen, and immediately feared. A shape on the horizon. The first written references to the island appear in fragmented maritime records, passed between sailors rather than officially logged. Long before GPS coordinates and digital maps, navigation depended on memory, stars, and word of mouth. And among those whispered warnings was one repeated phrase: "Do not land there." Sailors described seeing the island emerge from fog like a dark silhouette, its shoreline sharp and uninviting. Dense vegetation pressed all the way to the water's edge. No beaches. No clear landing points. Just green walls rising from black rock. Even from a distance, something about the island felt wrong. Birds circled it endlessly, yet none seemed to land. The water around it appeared unnaturally calm, even when surrounding seas were rough. Those who sailed too close reported an overwhelming sense of unease. Not fear. Something quieter. A pressure. A feeling of being observed. And then there were the stories. Stories of boats drifting away from the island without explanation. Of compasses spinning wildly. Of crews refusing to sleep when the island was visible. Many of these accounts were dismissed as superstition. But not all of them. Because some ships never returned. Early attempts to land. The first confirmed attempt to land on the island occurred during the early age of exploration, when uncharted territories were viewed as prizes rather than warnings. A small expedition vessel was dispatched to investigate the island's potential. Its mission was simple. Approach the shoreline. Send a small team ashore. Return with observations. The ship anchored just offshore. Boats were lowered. And that is where the official record ends. The expedition never returned. No distress signals were recorded. No wreckage was found. The ship simply vanished. At the time, this was not unusual. The sea claimed many vessels. But years later, when another expedition attempted the same approach, history repeated itself. This time, survivors were found. but their accounts were deeply unsettling. The survivors who refused to speak. The second expedition fared slightly better. The ship did not vanish entirely. Instead, it was discovered drifting weeks later, far from the island, with its sails damaged and its hull intact. Only a handful of crew members remained aboard. They were alive, but changed. According to recovery reports, the survivors displayed severe psychological distress. They refused to speak about what they had seen. Not immediately. Not later. Some never spoke again at all. Others spoke only in fragments. They described reaching the shoreline, and being unable to proceed further. Not because of physical barriers, but because of an overwhelming instinct to turn back. A feeling so strong that it overrode orders, logic, and curiosity. One survivor reportedly said, "It did not want us there." Whether this was metaphor or fear-induced imagination was never clarified. What mattered was the outcome. The expedition was deemed a failure. And unofficial warnings began circulating among maritime communities. An island without ownership. For centuries, the island remained unclaimed. No nation officially controlled it. No flags were raised. No settlements established. This alone was unusual. Most land, especially islands of strategic location, were quickly claimed during periods of expansion. But this island was consistently avoided. Even as maps became more detailed, the island was often marked with vague annotations. Restricted. Uninhabited. Dangerous waters. In some maps, it was omitted entirely. In others, it appeared without a name. And then, in the modern era, something changed. The island was officially designated as off-limits. The ban that raised questions. In the mid-20th century, international maritime authorities issued a formal restriction. Ships were prohibited from approaching the island within a certain distance. Aircraft were advised to avoid flying overhead. No civilian access was permitted. The official reason cited was protection. Protection of what, exactly, was never clearly stated. Some documents referenced indigenous inhabitants. Others mentioned environmental preservation. But the language was vague and contradictory. Satellite imagery was limited. Research requests were denied. Exploration proposals were rejected without explanation. The island had gone from ignored to guarded. And that raised an obvious question. Why now? The people who lived there. Despite its isolation, the island was not empty. It was home to a small, isolated population believed to have lived there for thousands of years. They had no recorded contact with the outside world. No written language. No known trade routes. Anthropologists theorized that the inhabitants descended from early coastal populations that became completely cut off. Over generations, their culture evolved in total isolation. They developed their own rules, their own boundaries. And most importantly, their own warnings. Any attempt to approach the island was met with hostility. Boats were turned away. In some cases, attacked. Not out of aggression, but defense. The inhabitants made it clear. They did not want contact. And the outside world, unusually, agreed. Why humans were forbidden? On the surface, the restriction seemed ethical. The inhabitants had no immunity to modern diseases. Contact could wipe them out. But this explanation did not account for everything. Why the extreme secrecy? Why the lack of documentation? Why the refusal to allow even distant study? There were rumors. Whispers among researchers and officials. Some claimed the island was used for classified testing. Others suggested it held archaeological significance too dangerous to expose. A few believed the restriction was not meant to protect the inhabitants, but to protect everyone else. A silence that persists. Today, the island remains untouched. No tourists. No researchers. No settlers. It exists in a strange state of recognition without access. Visible, but unreachable. And every few years, the story resurfaces. A fisherman who sailed too close. A drone that lost signal. A satellite image briefly appearing, then disappearing. Each incident adds to the mystery. And yet, the island remains silent. As if it is waiting. In the next part of this story, we will explore what little is known about the people who live there, and the encounters that ended all attempts at peaceful contact. But for now, the island remains where it has always been. Isolated. Forbidden. And watching. The people who never wanted contact. Long before the island was marked as forbidden on modern charts, it was already protected by something far more powerful than laws or patrols. Its people. They did not call their land an island. They had no word for ocean borders or nations beyond the horizon. To them, this place was simply the world. A complete and self-contained existence, surrounded by water that acted as both barrier and shield. Anthropologists believe the inhabitants arrived thousands of years ago, carried by primitive boats or drifting along ancient coastal routes. When sea levels rose, the land was cut off. And from that moment on, the people were alone. Generation after generation lived and died without knowledge of cities, machines, or written history. Their entire understanding of reality came from the forest, the shoreline, and the sky above. And within that understanding was one unbreakable rule. Outsiders must never be allowed to land. A culture shaped by isolation. Isolation does not freeze time. It reshapes it. Without outside influence, the island's culture evolved in ways completely unfamiliar to the modern world. Tools were simple, but effective. Shelters were built from local materials, blending seamlessly into the forest. Hunting and fishing followed strict patterns, guided by seasons rather than calendars. Everything they needed was already there. There was no reason to leave. And no reason to welcome anyone else. Early researchers studying similar isolated populations noted a common trait: a deep suspicion of anything unfamiliar. But on this island, that suspicion hardened into certainty. Outsiders were not curious visitors. They were threats. Not necessarily violent threats but invisible ones. Illness, disruption, change. And for a population with no immunity to the modern world, even a single encounter could mean extinction. The first recorded encounters. The earliest confirmed interactions between the island's inhabitants and outsiders were brief and hostile. Sailors approaching the shore were met with warning displays. Figures emerging from the tree line. Voices raised in unfamiliar language. Weapons held, but not thrown. The message was clear. Leave. Most ships complied. A few did not. Those that attempted to land were driven back with force. Arrows were fired not randomly, but precisely. Never lethal when they didn't need to be. Just enough to make the point unmistakable. And that point was respected. Word spread quickly among maritime communities. This island was not open to contact. Not negotiable. Not misunderstood. Intentional. A deadly lesson. One of the most well-documented incidents occurred in the late 19th century. A small group of explorers believed they could establish peaceful communication. They approached slowly. Left gifts at the shoreline. Retreated to their boats. For days, nothing happened. Then the gifts disappeared. Encouraged, the explorers returned. This time, they stepped onto the land. They did not make it far. Accounts differ on what happened next, but the outcome was the same. Only one explorer survived. He returned to his ship wounded, shaken, and silent. Later, he would say only this: they were not defending land. They were defending time. Shortly after, he died of an illness believed to have been contracted during the encounter. The rest of the group was never recovered. Why contact was always rejected? From a modern perspective, the hostility seems extreme. But to the inhabitants, it was survival. Contact with outsiders meant exposure to diseases they could not fight. It meant disruption of social structures refined over centuries. It meant the slow erasure of their world. They had no concept of globalization or cultural exchange. They understood only one truth. Everything beyond the horizon was dangerous. And every encounter reinforced that belief. Attempts at forced contact. Despite repeated failures, some authorities believed contact was inevitable, even necessary. They argued that isolation was unsustainable. That the inhabitants needed protection, education, and integration. Several attempts were made to observe from a distance. Boats anchored beyond arrow range. Researchers documented behaviors with binoculars and cameras. What they saw was unsettling. The inhabitants reacted to distant ships with immediate alertness. Movement stopped. Children were gathered. Defensive positions were taken. There was no curiosity, only readiness. And then, without warning, the forest would swallow them again, as if they had never been there. The incident that ended all attempts. The final attempt at organized contact occurred decades ago. A government-backed expedition approached the island under strict protocols. No landing. No interaction. Only observation. A helicopter was used to drop supplies on the beach: food, tools, symbolic offerings. The helicopter hovered briefly, and then retreated. The supplies were examined, then destroyed. Within hours, the shoreline was empty again. But something else happened. The helicopter experienced sudden mechanical failure on its return flight. It managed to land safely elsewhere, but investigators were unable to determine the cause. No sabotage. No environmental explanation. Just failure. After that incident, all direct attempts ceased. The island was officially classified as off-limits. The official explanation. Publicly, the ban was justified as protection. Protection of the inhabitants' right to remain isolated. Protection of their health. Protection of their culture. And this explanation is, in many ways, valid. But it does not explain everything. Why the strict airspace restrictions? Why the lack of updated imagery? Why the secrecy surrounding internal reports? Why are even humanitarian organizations denied access? These questions remain unanswered. Whispers behind closed doors. Among researchers, a quieter conversation exists. One that does not appear in official documents. Some suggest the island's inhabitants are not merely isolated, but intentionally resistant. Not just culturally but psychologically. They appear to possess an unusually strong collective response to intrusion. A level of coordination and awareness that defies expectations. They react instantly. They never hesitate. They never retreat unless the threat is gone. And once it is, they vanish. No traces. No lingering presence. As if the forest itself absorbs them. The island as a boundary. Over time, the island became more than a place. It became a boundary. A reminder that not every corner of the world belongs to exploration. That some spaces are meant to remain untouched. Not because they are dangerous, but because they are complete. In refusing contact, the island's inhabitants preserved something the modern world lost long ago. A world without observers. A life without interruption. And they will defend it at any cost. In the next part of this story, we will examine what happens when modern technology challenges that isolation and why even satellites struggle to reveal what lies beneath the forest canopy. For now, the island remains quiet. And its people remain unseen. The technology that couldn't penetrate the island. As the modern world expanded, it brought with it a belief that no place could remain hidden forever. Satellites would see what ships could not. Aircraft would map what forests concealed. Technology, it was assumed, would quietly solve the mystery. But the island did not yield so easily. In fact, the more advanced the tools became, the more resistant the island appeared to be. It was as if every attempt to observe it from afar only deepened the sense that something there refused to be understood. The first aerial surveys. The earliest aerial images of the island were grainy and incomplete. Captured from high altitude, the island appeared as a dense, uninterrupted canopy of green. No clearings. No roads. No signs of permanent structures. Just forest. At first, this seemed unremarkable. Many remote islands appear similar from above. But repeated flyovers revealed something unusual. The canopy showed patterns inconsistent with natural growth. Subtle geometric spacing. Repetitive clearings that appeared, and then vanished in later images. Some analysts suggested seasonal changes. Others suspected data corruption. But the anomalies persisted. And no explanation fully accounted for them. The problem with satellites. As satellite imaging improved, expectations grew. High-resolution imagery should have revealed settlements, pathways, or at least signs of long-term habitation. But the images remained frustratingly unclear. Cloud cover often obscured the island even on days when surrounding regions were clear. When clouds were absent, image quality degraded inexplicably. Edges blurred. Details softened. In some cases, entire frames were missing. Technicians initially blamed equipment malfunction. But patterns emerged. The degradation occurred almost exclusively over the island. Other nearby land masses appeared sharp and detailed. Only this one resisted clarity. Restricted data. Requests for detailed satellite imagery were often denied. Researchers found themselves blocked by vague security classifications. When pressed, officials cited privacy protections for isolated populations. Environmental safeguards. International agreements. Yet these justifications felt incomplete. Comparable islands with protected populations were still monitored remotely. Why was this one different? Why did even indirect observation require layers of approval? Some researchers began to suspect that the restrictions were not solely about ethics. They were about uncertainty. Drones and disappearances. With the rise of unmanned aerial vehicles, a new approach emerged. Small drones could approach without risking human life. They could hover, record, withdraw. Several unofficial attempts were made. None succeeded. Drones lost signal as they neared the island. Some returned with corrupted footage. Others did not return at all. One drone, recovered days later on a distant shoreline, showed something strange. Its memory card contained only static. but the final seconds of audio barely audible beneath interference captured a sound that analysts struggled to identify. A rhythmic noise. Not mechanical. Not environmental. Almost vocal. The origin was never confirmed. The ocean around the island. Attention eventually shifted from the land to the surrounding water. Sonar scans revealed irregularities beneath the surface. Unusual underwater formations. Sharp drop-offs. Complex reef systems. Nothing overtly unnatural. But navigation data showed something odd. Ships passing near the island often experienced minor instrument errors. Compass drift. GPS inaccuracies. Nothing severe. Just enough to complicate precise positioning. Pilots flying overhead reported similar issues. Temporary signal loss. Altitude fluctuations. Always brief. Always unexplained. Psychological effects. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of technological observation was not what it revealed, but how it affected those involved. Researchers reported a growing sense of discomfort when studying the island. Difficulty concentrating. Persistent unease. Some described vivid dreams after reviewing imagery. Dreams of standing at the edge of a forest. Of being watched. Of knowing they were not welcome. These accounts were informal, dismissed as stress or suggestion. But their consistency raised quiet concern. A place that rejects observation. Over time, a hypothesis emerged. Not officially documented. Not publicly acknowledged. The idea was simple. The island does not merely resist contact. It resists observation. Not through force, but through subtle disruption. Signal interference. Data degradation. Human discomfort. None of these alone prove anything. But together, they form a pattern. A pattern suggesting that the island exists in a state of deliberate isolation, one that technology cannot easily penetrate. Why this matters? In a world where almost every corner has been mapped, monitored, and measured, this island remains an exception. Not because it is hidden, but because it refuses to be revealed. And that raises a troubling question. Is the isolation of the island a natural outcome of geography and culture? Or is it something more? In the final part of this story, we will explore the theories that attempt to explain why this island remains forbidden and what might happen if that boundary is ever crossed. For now, the screens remain dark. The signals remain unclear. And the island remains unseen. Why some places must remain untouched. In the modern world, silence is rare. Almost every place on Earth is measured, catalogued, and shared. Satellites circle endlessly. Signals bounce between towers. Information flows without pause. And yet, the island remains unvisited, unrecorded, unchanged. Not because it is hidden, but because it is deliberately left alone. And that distinction matters. The question no one can answer. Every mystery eventually leads to the same question. Why? Why forbid access entirely? Why maintain strict boundaries even as technology advances? Why does the world collectively agree to look away? Official explanations return again and again to ethics. The right of an isolated people to remain untouched. The responsibility to avoid harm. The danger of disease. All of this is true. But it is not the whole truth. Because ethics alone do not explain the level of restraint. There are no research stations nearby. No long-term observation platforms. No gradual contact programs. Just distance. Permanent, enforced distance. The weight of history. History has taught a painful lesson. Every time isolation has been broken, something irreplaceable disappears. Languages vanish. Cultures dissolve. Worldviews collapse. And once that happens, there is no return. The island represents a rare exception. A place where history did not continue forward but inward. Where time folded in on itself. Where generations lived without knowing they were isolated. To them, the world never changed. Only the tides did. Theories that refuse to fade. Despite official silence, theories persist. Some are grounded in anthropology. The Icelanders' hostility is viewed as a learned response, passed down through generations after early traumatic encounters. Others suggest something environmental. Unusual electromagnetic activity. Geological features affecting navigation and perception. Then there are theories that cannot be easily categorized. Ideas whispered rather than published. That the island's isolation is not just cultural, but psychological. That the inhabitants possess an instinctive awareness of intrusion. That the land itself influences behavior. These ideas are speculative. Unproven. But they linger because nothing has disproven them. The final boundary. What makes the island different from other forbidden places is not danger. It is intention. Nuclear sites are restricted because they are hazardous. Military zones because they are strategic. But this island is restricted because it has chosen to be. And the modern world has chosen unusually to respect that choice. This is not a failure of exploration. It is a refusal. A rare moment where humanity stops advancing, and listens. The quiet agreement. No announcement marked the moment when the island became permanently off-limits. There was no ceremony. No declaration. Just a gradual consensus. Ships adjusted routes. Maps updated annotations. Flight paths shifted. The island faded into the background. Not forgotten but intentionally ignored. And in that ignoring, something remarkable happened. The island was preserved. Not as a museum. Not as a subject. But as a living world untouched by observation. What would happen if we returned? This question is asked often. What if contact were attempted again? What if technology advanced enough to penetrate the silence? What if curiosity overcame restraint? There are no good answers. Contact would change everything. For the Icelanders, it could mean illness, disruption, collapse. For the outside world, it would mean responsibility. And responsibility is heavier than curiosity. Once the boundary is crossed, it cannot be restored. The meaning of the island. In the end, the island's mystery may not lie in what it hides, but in what it represents. A reminder that not everything must be known. That not every place exists to be accessed. That some boundaries exist for reasons deeper than fear. The island challenges the idea that progress is always forward. Sometimes, progress is restraint. Sometimes, wisdom is distance. A place left in peace. Tonight, as satellites pass overhead and ships move along distant routes, the island remains exactly as it was. Children grow without knowing cameras exist. Elders tell stories that never leave the forest. Life continues without interruption. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all. Not what the island contains, but how rare it is to find a place the world agreed not to take. As this story comes to rest, the island does not fade away. It simply continues. Quietly. Unobserved. Undisturbed. A world within a world. And as you drift toward sleep, remember. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some places are not meant to be reached. And some silences are worth preserving.